The Hoop Heads Podcast is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
Hi, this is Sean McDonald, boys varsity basketball coach at University School in Cleveland, Ohio. You're listening to the Hoop Heads Podcast.
Hey Hoop Heads! Wanted to take a minute to shout out our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market, and they truly accelerate skill development faster than ever. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoop Heads Podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Also, make sure to check out the new Dr. Dish Home Machine, which is perfect for these crazy times when gyms and schools are closed. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoop Heads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
You're not sitting there telling them how to lead in these moments. You're helping them to interpret their experiences and make better decisions.
JP Nerbun is the founder of Thrive on Challenge and a previous guest on the Hoop Heads Pod. JP will be joining us periodically for what we're calling Culture Camp, where JP and I discuss a topic related to improving the culture of your team. On this episode, we'll be discussing how to implement a Captain's Council with your team. Don't miss our free Hoop Heads Pod webinar series on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. If you miss a live webinar, you can buy lifetime access to any of our previous webinars for $4.99 on the Hoop Heads Pod website. If you're focused on improving your coaching and your team, we've got you covered. Visit hoopheadspod.com/webinars to get registered. Make sure you check out our new Hoop Heads Pod network of shows, including Thrive with Trevor Huffman, Beyond the Ball, the CoachMaze.com podcast, Players Court, Bleachers and Boards, and our team-focused NBA podcasts, Cavaliers Central, Grizz and Grind, Nuck If You Buck, and the 305 Culture Miami Heat podcast. We're looking for more NBA podcasters interested in hosting their own shows centered on a particular team. Shoot an email to info@hoopheadspod.com if you're interested in learning more and bringing your talent to our network. Have your pen and paper at the ready as you listen to this Culture Camp episode with JP Nerbun from Thrive on Challenge. Hello and welcome to the Hoop Heads Podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here this morning without my co-host Jason Sunkel, but I am pleased to be joined for our very first episode of Culture Camp by JP Nerbun from Thrive on Challenge. JP, welcome to the Hoop Heads Podcast. And I should say welcome back to the Hoop Heads Podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be back, brother.
All right, want to dive in right away. So for those of us who are listening, want to just explain a little bit about what JP and I have put together, and what we're thinking is that we're going to do this culture camp once a quarter, so 4 times a year, and we may, if it goes really well, we may end up doing a few more. But the idea here is to give you, as a basketball coach, some things that you can put into place with your team to help you to improve your culture. And we're going to start out today. Our first topic is going to be how to develop leaders on your team and create a captain's council. So JP, I'm going to let you take this from the beginning and just explain for people who maybe haven't heard of it, don't know what the concept is all about. Tell them what a captain's council is, and then we'll kind of dive into the nitty gritty of what they need to do to create one for their team.
Yeah, well, I think too, I think we could start too, not just even from what is the captain's council, or is just what is the current system that people use or approach to develop leaders, to address leadership challenges or a scarcity of leadership, right? So I think one of the common themes in developing culture, or just common themes of coaches' struggles today, is, I don't have any leaders. I just don't have many leaders on my team. And I think that there's a lot of resources out there that are promoting leadership development. And when you look at the research, when you really start to dive into leadership development, which is not just in sports, right? It's in business and healthcare, education. People are trying to develop leaders because they see, there's a premium paid for it, right? This is why CEOs get paid so much. But, good leadership is scarce, so people are trying to develop it. So there's actually been a good bit of research out there when it comes to the business world, the education world, that I think is applicable to leadership in sports. And the thing that people, I think, get wrong in this approach is they try to develop leaders in a classroom. They try to develop them through leadership sessions, leadership type retreats. It's not to say there's no benefit in those things. There is benefit. They're good. They're well intentioned, and they can be engaging, and they can impart good lessons. But there's 4 key things that you need to effectively develop leaders. And this is all the research from Harvard, all those Ivy League schools, as well as when you read about the All Blacks rugby team from New Zealand and James Kerr's book Legacy, or you read about the captain's class by Sam Walker. I mean, I could list off a good few books there of just show other elite sports teams and how they do it. Well, there has to be, one of those key elements is a leadership system, a system that actually really clearly communicates various roles and decentralizes command throughout your organization. And so you need a leadership system. The second big thing you need experiential leaders. You wouldn't develop strength by going into a classroom and talking about how to build strength. You actually develop strength by actually getting there and putting the reps in, right? It doesn't mean there's no value in not educating people about, about strength, or in this case, educating people about leadership. But to develop it, we all as coaches know this, especially ones that have gone from assistant coach to their first head coaching role. It's a big change. Being the real leader, the number one person people are looking for, and nothing prepares you for certain things than actually just doing it, right? And getting that experience. So experiential learning is a big thing. And then personal development, like growing yourself, growing your own character. That's the third element. And lastly is leader mentorship, or just having people to guide you on your leadership journey. That's so valuable. And the Captain's Council system that we work with so many coaches, it helps to address those 4 things.
So how do you go about taking it from the theoretical? I think one of the problems that I see with coaching is when you talk about developing leaders, and I'm gonna go back even one step beyond coaches doing it in the classroom. I think a lot of times what we see is coaches who say, man, our team just doesn't have any leaders. We don't have any leaders, or our captains just aren't doing what we need them to do. And yet so often, not only are the players not getting what you described, but they're not even getting any classroom instruction. It's just, okay, you two are our captains, figure out what you're supposed to do as a captain. And too often, I think as adults, we expect kids to understand what we want from them as leaders without going through the process of teaching them what that looks like and showing them how they're supposed to act as leaders. So talk to us a little bit about how you take it from the theoretical classroom leadership lessons into what you actually want to see them doing in practice.
Yeah, so there's 3 really big phases that I like to talk about. And the first is selecting. The second is, how you really lay out a foundation and empower them from the get-go. And then the last thing is just, are you weekly, are you daily creating opportunities for them to lead? And so let's just share a little bit about the selection process. I was just on a call the other day with a hockey coach up in Canada. And, his whole argument was they asked their players' opinion last year when it came to selecting their captain, who they thought would be the leader. But at the end of the day, they thought he was like, but they got it wrong. And so we had to, we just didn't feel comfortable with their answer. So we picked somebody else. And I definitely get that whole idea of like, well, man, the players, they select the guy that it's just a popularity contest. It's not really who's a real leader. The guy doesn't work hard, doesn't have a good attitude. And so I've been that coach. I mean, I've tried every system possible to select my captains, from player vote to non-vote to just saying, forget about it. I'm going to pick it every game. We're going to have a different captain. But this is the system we've come across is that we've found to be most effective is that players select, but because players are, and this is my argument for that hockey coach, was like, but that's who they look towards. And the bottom line is your leadership system needs to identify, first off, who are the influencers, in particular, the influencer. There is a player on your team that is probably a greater influencer than you are as the head coach. That's like proven, right? Like they will follow. If you can get that person to be bought in, to be a strong leader, in the way that you want them to be, to buy into the culture that you're trying to help develop and create with them, then you're at a good start. So you really want them to select, but it doesn't mean that we're just really nonchalant about this. In fact, the selection process, it's about getting them to create a job description and then be really clear about the responsibilities. And those responsibilities, when we're, so the players, first off, they'll create the job description by reflecting on a great leader that they've been around, and they'll create some qualities and some behaviors. And that's what they'll vote on. They'll vote on that type, in those categories, on those behaviors, on those values, on those qualities of a leader they're looking for, as well as those people that are accepting that role are acknowledging that they're going to have certain responsibilities. So just from the very selection process, we try to be intentional to, first off, identify the people that are going to be great influencers. I think that's a really big first step.
All right. So what does a job description look like? Give us some examples of things that would be listed in a job description with some of the teams that you've worked with. What are players, coaches? What are some things that we should be looking to include in that job description?
You always just maybe want to start from like those values or qualities, like just, hey, how would you describe those leaders? And just give us a few words. And you kind of get them to kind of come up with a few common ones. And then you say, okay, what's that look like in action? And so they could say, oh, we want a selfless and an accountable leader that's hardworking. Okay, well, how have you seen someone be a selfless leader before? And so you get them to have a conversation. It's a powerful team activity. It'll take you 15 to 30 minutes to create it as a team. It's powerful just to get them to reflect on, oh, what do we actually need? What do we need in a leader? What makes a great leader? That in itself is a leadership lesson. And it's probably the only part of our Captain's Council system that we actually have in the classroom, really, and is that creation of it. So you get them to come up with that, but then you also add your own responsibilities to that. And I'm a big believer in captain's commitments. So what we want is the captains to make commitments to serve, a commitment to support, a commitment to connect. And those become really clear behaviors, like serving is like carrying the water, eating last, sweeping the sheds. There's different things like that. But those commitments will come up later, but you let them know that this is not a position of, a title. This is not some just honorary title that you would be receiving. This is a responsibility to serve your team. And you're going to come up with that and support your team. And you're going to have to really be clear on what that looks like and how you'll do that if you're selected captains. So that's kind of how you start to create that job description.
At what point in your season do you recommend, or have you seen coaches do this and create the job description? Is it something that you do the day tryouts are finished and you've kind of got your final roster? Is it something that you do closer to the first game or competition where you've kind of gotten a chance to get a feel for your team? When do you recommend coaches start this process of creating the Captain's Council?
I like earlier, but I don't like the voting process until a little bit later, because it gives people a little bit of hey, well, this is what I have to start striving to be within our program. And you want your culture, coaches are really quick. They want to, that I work with and support on this, they're very eager to do it like really quickly. They just it's like, oh, we ticked the box. We got our captains, and it's like, but wait for things to evolve. Like I've had, Division I program, and they brought in maybe 7 new freshmen, and they voted for the Captain's Council like week 1 in June. And well, who got elected? These seniors, but they weren't really great leaders, and it evolved over the years. Like the players actually didn't come to respect them as soon as they started to learn it. And it was they missed an opportunity to kind of reset the culture that year in that way. So just letting the season kind of play out a little bit, I think that's a valuable thing. To just give it time before you have players vote on that is huge.
All right. So once you have the captains in place, the job description has been created, you've then looked at what the qualities are, what the things are that you want the captains to do. Now you've selected who the captains are going to be. Now we're getting down to what is it that the coach needs to do in order to facilitate the captain being the best that they can possibly be in that role. What does that look like? What does the teaching process from me as a coach, what do I need to do to support those captains, to give them the tools that they need in order to lead the rest of our team?
Yeah, I would say one big thing is to serve them. And your very first kind of thing I would do is I would lower myself as the coach, and maybe that's a bad phrase for it, but I'm going to cook them a meal. I'm going to bring them breakfast. I'm going to do something, at least it has even just depends on your situation. But a lot of our coaches would have them over for dinner, but they would cook them a meal. They would really put a lot of time and effort serving them first. They want to model that servant leadership. The other thing is you really got to help them in that meeting to believe in themselves, but also to clarify what are they going to work at to do to serve their team. That's where you come up with those captain's commitments. And these are not things that you're like New Year's commitments and they come up with them, and then 2 weeks later when they're not doing them, you're on their case, come on, you said you want to be a leader. No, those are things that they're going to strive for and you're going to work for, and you're going to be a support for them. You're going to be that mentor to help them through, like, hey, you're having a tough time supporting this person on the team. What are some things you could do this week because they're struggling? And so they become, but you start off with getting them to make a few commitments. And the last big thing is our unit selection. So we advocate for a 1-4 or 1-3 ratio of captains to players, because we want each captain. Comes down to this idea around decentralized command, which is a term that's used, it's very popular in the military, like the SEALs. But it's this whole idea of like, I, as the coach, if I'm coaching 15 players, I can't effectively lead, mentor, and support and serve all 15 players. I can't see what's all going on. So as a coach, I'm going to have my captains, and but they can't. I'm not just going to say, all right, there's 2 captains and go lead 15 people. We're saying here's 4 or 5 captains, and each of you is in charge of serving, supporting, connecting with those 2 or 3 individuals. And so that decentralized command helps to create a more manageable situation where they're going to be more successful. And it's not asking like, oh, we need you to check in with 10 different guys, right? We're saying, hey, you're responsible for this guy, this guy, this guy. And then when certain players struggle, this is where you start to get into it. So you've kind of laid that out. Once you start getting into the season, now there's a situation with a certain player. Well, you can go to his captain. Hey, how can we help that individual? He's struggling here. He's struggling to show up on time. He's struggling with when things don't go his way on the court. He's struggling with something at home. He's struggling in the classroom. Now you have people, and it's not all on you as a coach. And that's the beauty of this system, is this system is not more work for you as a coach. It's not, here we go. Here's another culture thing that you've got to do that JP says. It actually, over time, saves you so much time and effort if you do this.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question that has been something that has been talked about here on the podcast by numerous different coaches, and that is that when they're young coaches and they're first getting into the business, and clearly most coaches are driven towards success and want to have their finger on everything going on within the team, and they want to make sure that they're controlling. And a lot of times they get into a situation where you have some micromanagement issues where I have to have my hand in everything. And then you'll hear these coaches talk about the fact that when I was younger, I was doing everything, and I felt like I had to be overseeing this part of the team, and I had to be overseeing that, and I had to be watching this assistant coach, and I had to be running that. And they said over time that by releasing some of those responsibilities to people who they have trained and worked with and know what it is that the head coach wants, that's really when they felt like true success came to them. Because instead of, as you said, increasing their workload, it's really decreasing it and allowing other people to flourish and be able to buy into that collective that you're trying to build. So when you think about working with coaches, what do you do to overcome, I don't know if resistance is the right word, but some of the hesitation that a coach may have to offload some of these responsibilities to, whether it's in this case players, but other assistant coaches? Just talk a little bit about that ability to delegate and how important that is.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I'm guilty of so much of this stuff. So like, it's not because I had it figured out right away. It's because I've failed so often at some of this stuff. And I'm one that was a big control guy as well. Like, I want them to take ownership, but I need it done in the right way, in the way that I want it. And this is kind of like the paradox, one of the great paradoxes of leadership, and the great paradoxes of of trying to develop a player-led team. And we have a high sense of ownership for our team. Why? Because we have such a strong amount of control. Research shows that ownership that sense of ownership, a psychological ownership, it emerges in three different things. One is I have a sense of control, and that's obvious, right? I feel like I can make decisions. I can make decisions on this, okay? Not just do I have, is my opinion heard, but I actually sometimes get to make decisions on something. Secondly is intimate knowledge, my understanding or my relationship with whatever it is. So in our case, the team. So do I have a strong relationships and connection? And the third thing that research shows is self-investment. So the more I've had to invest in the team, the more I'm going to feel ownership of it. Okay. So we've invested a lot as coaches. We invest a lot of time. We sometimes maybe struggle with that connection, but we feel like we know our team really, really well on the inside out. So that intimate knowledge, we're good. And then we obviously do in most structures and most organizational structures, we have a large amount of control. So offloading that control is key to get players to take ownership. But the trick is when you give them control over something, they don't always do it the way we want, and they don't always do it. They fail. They make mistakes. And that's where coaches, well, I let them run a practice. It was horrible. I don't even suggest you let them run a practice, right? But, right off the bat, I'm suggesting like you give them certain opportunities. And then you're not there to go, well, see, I knew you weren't ready for this, or you don't give them those opportunities just to be ready to call them out on it. You give them opportunities and you provide support. It's autonomy to make choices, to make decisions, but you let them experience those consequences. But then you're not just, well, you did it wrong. It's like, how can you do that better? So you provide this support with this control. And when you do that, that's where like that experiential learning comes in that we talked about earlier. And that's where the leader mentorship comes in. You're not sitting there telling them how to lead in these moments. You're helping them to interpret their experiences and make better decisions. And that's a real big challenge because it's not going to be at the pace that we want to. And we're going to have to sacrifice short-term results, for long-term benefits.
So what does that look like in terms of support? Give us a concrete example of something that you might, as a coach, ask a captain to do, and then what the post-game analysis would look like, so to speak, with the player after they go through the experience that you're asking them to lead.
So I'll give you two examples. One's off the court and then one's on the court. But you should be looking for these things every day and within your program. One off the court, one of the best things you can do is meet weekly with your captains. In fact, it's the most foundational thing to do is sit down with them. And let's say a certain player is struggling to show up on time. Or let's say, you know for some reason, or maybe you stage it, but you want them to start practice. Well, you might task them with that in the weekly meeting. And then in the next week, you go, well, how is this player doing on showing up on time? He's in your unit. Oh, he still was late. Okay, well, what's he struggling with? And whatever consequence you maybe have for that player, maybe that captain reaps that consequence as well, or maybe it's just you're on them about that. When it comes to starting practice, how do we do at starting our practice session without me having to blow the whistle and say, all right, here we go, 4 lines or whatever you start practice? Why are you having to do that all the time? They should be able to start it when they know the time is there. So it's just something you can work with them off the court, but then on the court or on the field, wherever you are, whatever sport you're coaching at, when you're in these situations and practice is not at the standard it needs to be, for instance, the energy drops down, you might get with your captains. You guys right now, is this what we want to be? Is this who we want to be? Is this who we are? No. Okay. You guys got to fix it. And you're just putting them in that situation. And they may struggle. They may not fix it. Then you might pull them back. Here, captains and coaches, let's sit down. Let's talk. Okay, what's the big obstacle here? What's the challenge? Well, this person's not going hard. This person's really struggling. They're not locked in. Okay, so what can you do right now about that? Okay, well, you can have that one-on-one conversation that's so stinking hard that we never get. We struggle to get players to do. So there's some little things like that. When you encounter things that I always say you don't like to do, like clean up the locker room, for instance. Oh man, your coaches are always complaining, I got to clean up the locker room. Okay, you might just say, hey, Mike, your unit today, you guys got cleanup. Well, Mike's in there with his unit trying to clean up the locker room. What happens? Your unit, they're kind of like, oh yeah, they do a bit of this, they don't do a good job, and they peace out. And you're left cleaning the locker room by yourself. And if it's not up to standard, you're doing it again the next day, right? But you have to get to experience that moment as a captain, the frustration of getting other people to do something they don't want to do, but you only hold them accountable. You don't get on necessarily the other players. So they have to struggle with the consequences. So you can offload things that you don't want to do, but you can also offload things that are really challenging situations. And I know I'm kind of going off on another one here, but this is huge. Like, I talk to coaches and they're like, how do you, one of my favorite questions is, how do you currently give your players opportunities to lead? What decisions do they make in your program? Number one thing, they pick out the uniforms, they pick out the shoes for the season. Well, the only thing they'll take ownership of then is, bottom line, is what they look like on game day. If they look like garbage, it's on them. But we have to give them real insight and influence over decisions that matter. And think about it from this. Nate, co-host of my podcast, I know he's been on yours. He had this great example a few years ago where he's thinking about, do I move this player up to the varsity or not? It would have been an unpopular decision. Some people, the team might have been torn on it, but he brought him in there and he said, let's look at the situation. We bring her up. These are the benefits. We don't bring her up. These are also some of the, the benefits, just this is the challenge. What do you think? And they got to be a part of that decision-making process, which what ends up happening? They go in the locker room and people are like, oh, why is she being brought up? Well, they're like, well, this is actually why. They understand the challenge of leadership.
How important do you think it is, and this goes maybe beyond just what we're talking about here in terms of creating the council and developing leaders, but I think it speaks to kind of the situation where we are in coaching today and the relationship between coach and players. Just talk a little bit about how important it is to, in anything, and especially when you're trying to develop leaders, to explain to them the why behind what you're doing, and then also then why the captains can then turn and explain the why to their small group. Why is the why so important?
I think the more transparent we can be in that process, the more you're going to understand, why it was made, and you're more bought in, and they're going to feel at least. I think there's a couple of things. One is just to be able to get them to see a different perspective. I think that there's that aspect there. But I think it comes back to that intimate knowledge aspect of ownership. They may not have made the decision themselves, but they'll understand a little bit more, and thus they'll have a little bit more ownership to kind of protect that decision that was made, or why you chose a certain strategy or a certain different approach to something.
If you have an existing podcast or are looking to launch your own pod but aren't sure where to start, the team at My Podcast Manager can help. Our podcast team works behind the scenes so you can do what you do best. We'll help you launch your podcast, make it sound great, and free up your time for the more enjoyable parts of podcasting. If you're ready to put your podcast editing, production, and promotion on autopilot with a trusted team of podcasting professionals, visit mypodcastmanager.com to get started. I know one of the things that you said that is created when you have a captain's council is just making the experience better for the players who are part of the team. And obviously I think that that's one of our jobs as a coach, is to make sure that the kids like playing for our team. That doesn't mean that every single moment of it is enjoyable, but that overall you're creating a positive experience. So in your mind, how does creating a captain's council and helping develop the leadership skills of your players, how does that create a more positive experience for the kids, as opposed to it just being everything coming down from the head coach or the staff?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll tell you a really cool story about this. A coach I've been working with, for about a little over 3 years now, Kevin Orr at Rice Lake High School in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. He when I first started working with Kevin, he wasn't a big captain's guy like many coaches out there. It's like, it's just a pain. It's just ceremonial. Like all this usual arguments that we all have about why we don't want to do captains. And he's become a massive believer in the captain's council, a huge fan of it, because it's made his job easier. But I'll tell you, just last year, I was up in Rice Lake working with his team, and we had our first captain's meeting, and we sat down and we're selecting units. And this one player, who was a senior and a captain, he chose one of the players to put in his units that I wouldn't say other people didn't want. It was just like one of those kids that maybe was on the outside of the team. He wasn't super connected. and he's just a little bit different, different kid. But this captain said in that meeting, like, I want this guy because, I want to make this like an amazing year for him. And like, it was a really cool moment, right? So you think, oh, that's great. This guy's making this commitment. He's picking him. He's like, I'm going to make it a great year for this guy. Well, at the end of the season, Kevin sat down with that player who was selected for that unit and asked about his experience. And he said he had never been so connected to a team in his life before. He never felt so much a part of a group. Now, I don't think that happens if, first off, you don't take the captains, there's not the intentionality to make sure there's the units. And secondly, you don't allow them the decision of who's in their unit. I'm picking him, autonomy. Now I have this sense of ownership of making sure this kid's experience is great. Comes back to your why. Why are we doing this captain's council? To make sure everyone feels connected, everyone feels seen, feels known, and feels cared for. And that's just one story about, just how the impact can be on the player experience, because they're looking after each other and we have a certain responsibility, where so often it's just like, well, it's not my fault he doesn't feel part of the team. Like, he's just different, right? That would be the take of so many captains.
All right. So you're kind of hinting at it here, but when you as a coach are setting up the selection process for who is in which leader's unit, what does that process look like? Is it a draft? Is it a discussion where we place players with certain captains? How does the process go about of assigning a player to a captain? What does that look like?
Honestly, there's a few different options there that we like to work with our coaches on, because it kind of depends on the situation and the level of safety within that group from the get-go. Some coaches are starting this, they're already really connected with their captains. There's already a high level of maturity. Other coaches maybe struggle with that. Maybe you are one of those coaches where a player's been elected captain. You're like, oh, he is not a good leader, right? And you're in those situations and he's just going to pick his best friend. Now, sometimes picking someone that is you already have a strong connection with in your unit, that's a good thing, right? It allows you to help support that person that may encounter a lot of challenges. Also, you don't want to just load up certain units with a lot of it's really challenging kids when it comes to their level of commitment or attitude. You want to kind of space them out so so you can kind of get a bit of balance to that. So there's a lot of ways, but the more you can bring players in, I say this, the more that a coach would bring players into that selection process, the more they're part of the discussion, the better success you will have moving forward with the units.
All right. So you want to balance out what you're saying is the level of, I'm going to use the word coachability or attitude. You don't want to have all the super coachable kids in one group and all the kids who are maybe a little bit more of a challenge in another group. How does it work in terms of, or do you have any recommendations when it comes to the player's ability or where they stand in the pecking order of the team? Like, do you want to balance, if I have the second best player in one unit, do I then want to have the sixth and the 11th best player in that particular unit? How do you balance out the levels of the players, if that question makes any sense?
Yeah, as far as who's into the units?
Yeah, so like, do I want to have, like, let's say that I have one unit and for whatever reason that one unit is made up of all the starters and the next unit is made up of the three players on the bench who play the most minutes, and then the last cohort is the final four kids on the bench? Or do I want to have one starter, one reserve, and one kid who doesn't play hardly at all as part of the group? Or does it not matter in your experience?
I think you want diversity in that for sure. It's just not something that has ever really been much of an issue or come up with, and we've done this at, dozens and dozens of programs. It's just never been an issue, just because you usually get a captain that's not a starter, okay? And you're looking at that, you're mixing up, and you're talking about players that struggle with different things. So it's not usually something that comes up, but you definitely would want a diversity in their roles. I think probably the bigger question people ask is like, well, what do you do if you have a varsity, JV, and freshman? And I think there's great value in each team having their own individual identity. That's only my own personal philosophy. I don't know if there's a lot of research to show that that's actually better than, hey, we're all one team here. But the big question is, do you have captains that look over all three teams in the program, or do you have captains for each team? And I'm always a huge, regardless of whether you want one team identity or not, I think it's important for your freshman team. You want your captains there that are selected from there. And that's the beautiful thing about that is is you're giving players opportunities at the younger ages to develop leadership. And that's important. Like, for instance, I'm coaching a semi-pro team here in Ireland this year. I just kind of signed that a few weeks ago. And I've got players that are 30 years of age, and I got players that are 18, 17, 18. They're Irish, young Irish internationals with a real promising career. I don't just want the 30, 29, 28. I don't want the veterans as the ones that are selected captains. I'm going to do some things throughout the process to help encourage that we get at least one of our younger players voted a captain, because I want them to have experience to lead, but also I want them to really kind of represent that younger group within our team program here, within our club. So, you try to be really intentional and thoughtful, but everyone's situation is different.
Yeah, I can totally see the value in both sides of it. And it almost seems to me like a combination of those two systems would be the best, wherein I don't think that if you just have, thinking of a high school varsity program, if you just have the captains from your varsity team and those kids are responsible for their varsity teammates, but then they're also responsible for the JV and the freshmen who may not even be practicing with them at the same time. That to me seems like it would be difficult if that's the only situation you set up. Whereas if you have captains for your freshman team, you have captains for your JV team, now those players, one, as you said, can develop their leadership skills at a younger age, but also you have those leaders anywhere the team is, those leaders are going to be there. And so you have that leadership in place all the time. And yet at the same time, I could also see the value in having the varsity captain, the varsity unit, also overseeing the JV and freshman unit. So maybe being paired up in a group so that they can have discussions where maybe you sit down and, if you're doing a meeting with your captains on your own personal team. So let's say you're the varsity coach and you're doing those meetings once a week, maybe once a month you have a meeting with the varsity, JV, and freshman group together, have those captains come in and have a discussion about how it's going. So you're building an entire program. And I think that the most successful coaches from a high school standpoint are coaches that understand that they're not just coaching their varsity team, they're coaching a kindergarten through 12th grade program and are investing in kids at the younger ages so that it makes your job easier, obviously, when they get to the varsity, if they've already been trained in some of the things that you hope to instill once they get to the varsity level.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. You want, we're a big proponent of, if you got multiple teams, you still bring the captains together a few times a month or at least once a month. And I'd say the other thing too is, this isn't like, it's simple. It'll save you some time. It's not always easy. Sometimes you get a group of captains. Another big thing that's popular on the men's side is you get football players coming in late. Well, how do you handle that? And some of my resources I have for coaches, I kind of go into the details on just some different recommendations, but just having a diverse range of personalities in your group can be really critical. And that's one of the benefits of sometimes you get your football team that comes in late. You get to elect one or two more captains sometimes, and that can shake things up. I know we've had a few programs that really struggled the first half of the year. They're able to add one or two more players. That just became the catalyst for them taking off. And that's a big piece of it.
Now we know what the benefits can be to our teams when we develop these kinds of leaders, but let's break it down to an individual player and some of the experiences that you've seen with the transformation of a player in terms of the leadership skills that they've been able to develop. So in other words, have you had any experiences with kids that are on teams that you've worked with where this kid came in and maybe they were an average leader, or maybe they had no idea what leadership was, and you were able to see them bloom and blossom as a result of being a part of this particular type of system? Just maybe give us an example of a transformation that you saw in a player by participating in a captain's council.
Yeah, I'll tell you a cool one, and I don't know if he's been on the podcast before, but Mark Cassio down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Absolutely.
So I've been working with Mark for the last couple of years, and I had the fortune of not just going to his team and working with the program for a few days in the fall at the start off the season, but I got to come back up in January, and it was great to see that because I remember one of the first practices I was at, they were doing something that we call, which is like a team quick set, which is about, really holding them to a really high standard early in the practice. Well, the players are the only ones that can really hold them, they're required to do all the support. Coaches are only sitting there resetting drills. and you force the players to step up and communicate and hold each other accountable and support each other. Well, in that first kind of, as they're getting off the ground there's the one kid who is a great leader. He's a leader in the school. Everyone sees him as leader. And he was vocal. He was giving reminders. He was encouraging. He was letting guys know when they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. But nobody else was saying anything. Like, it was just dead quiet. And the coaches are just going, oh man, we really want to step in. We want to get on them. And but the way that we structure this part of practice is to force coaches to shut up and get players to speak up. Well, they had some success and they were fine there. Well, by January when I come back, I mean, it is night and day. We're not just talking about the captains. We're talking about all the players on there. But, that took a season of a lot of interventions and sometimes just putting it on the captains. But all of a sudden, in that drill, players have learned to be vocal, to speak up and support. And then on top of that, I'm seeing the quietest kid, one of the quietest kids I've ever met, who's on the captain's council. He's pulling guys aside and he's saying, he's giving them talks to on the sideline. He's helping them from the previous play. And that's a process to get there. But sometimes you're just forcing them to get into those situations, and the Captain's Council helps to do that. So I saw one of the most quietest, one of the most talented players of Mark's all of a sudden go from being that quiet, shy guy, and he wasn't being a loud, rah-rah guy. He wasn't giving big team talks, which I think sometimes we look for. He was leading in the way that Sam Walker identifies in the book, The Captain's Class, which it's a great book to check out.
Great book, absolutely.
16 of the best leaders, the best teams of all time. What do? They don't give rah-rah speeches. They're doing it in the side conversations. So the system does train it up on that, and that was just cool to see that in Mark's program last year as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make about what maybe the general public envisions as being a great leader. And so often we think of that rah-rah, big pregame talk and just somebody who's loud and vocal. And we don't always think about the player who's maybe a little quieter, maybe a little bit more subtle, that goes and puts their arm around somebody when they come off the floor and just says, hey, this is what you need to be doing, or hey, we should look at that. And I think that's something that as a coach, you have to recognize what your players' personalities are. And some people are never going to be that rah-rah leader. And I think on a team that's successful, and clearly if you've read The Captain's Class, you know that those leaders are oftentimes the best leaders are the ones that are more subtle as opposed to the ones that are right out in front of everybody and in their face. And so to see a kid be able to transform and go from somebody who isn't talking at all to somebody who really is leading in their own way, I'm sure is extremely, extremely rewarding for any coach who gets an opportunity to have their players develop in that way. When you start trying to implement the Captain's Council, and you've now done it with multiple coaches over multiple years, after getting feedback from coaches, what is their biggest challenge that they find in trying to implement this system with their team? So when you sit down and you debrief with them about, hey, how did this go, or how is it going? What are some of the things that they tell you are the biggest challenge to making sure that they institute this in the right way?
Two things, and it's so easy. The drama of selection, and the second thing is the weekly meeting. There's always drama on the selection. But you have to lean into that conflict. And what I mean by that is there's going to be a player that's nominated that doesn't get selected, or there's going to be a few. And coaches sometimes don't like this, captains in general, just because they're like, I don't want to deal with that player or that player's parents, right? That's another pieces of that well. But getting and working with that player to help them to reframe and to be aware. Yes, right off the bat, meeting with that player, hey, you're disappointed you weren't selected. And allowing them to articulate their frustrations and then say, well, now what's the story going to be? Is the story this year going to be how you were the disgruntled guy because you were pissed off you weren't selected captain? Or is it going to be where you stepped up and you still were a leader in these ways? And working with them and you're giving there's so many things that we talk about with our coaches on giving other players that aren't captains opportunities to lead and grow in leadership. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions, like, oh, it's only developing the 4 guys that are selected captain. That's totally false. There's so many things about the program that help to develop other leaders within that. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is when you get into the course of the season and things are going crazy, do you sit down and meet with them weekly? That's the most important thing. And what happens in that meeting? Is it a lecture, or are you coming there seeking to understand, get their opinion, ask questions? But that meeting, coaches get busy and there's a snowstorm. And then, so we always encourage coaches to have the same time each week. And I've got coaches that have done it on the back of the bus. They've done it in the stands before a game. They get their 15 to 30 minute meeting in. They do it. I've had coaches do it on Zoom before Zoom was even a big thing. I had a coach do that last season because of some snow, and he met with the captains at that stage. So the weekly meeting, staying committed as a coach to that weekly meeting is probably the biggest challenge.
Is it finding time? It's not necessarily the coach's commitment to it. Is it more just it's something that it's easy to kind of put on the back burner as opposed to, hey, let's cut down 15 or 20 minutes of our practice time on the floor in order to get this in. But instead, we're just like, we're just going to move on, and finding the time. Is that the biggest challenge?
Yeah, the commitment to make the time. It's making the time, right? And so that's what we always say, put it in the calendar. And if you have to reschedule, that's fine. You're just going to find another time for it. But it's just, is it a priority? Is it important? And the coaches, and we were doing a bunch of roundtables this spring with coaches in the TOC community. And every coach that talked about their captain's council and their story all said, if there's one thing you could do better, it would be like more meetings with the captains. Just every time you had one, it just helped to fix so much drama and problems.
Right, I'm sure.
It's like, why do I not stay committed? We get caught up in those things. It's a lot of things in life that are good for us that we choose not to do because we get caught up in other things that aren't as important, and it's only 15 minutes is really what we're asking coaches to do. But it's the most important piece of it.
All right. So those are the challenges that coaches face. Tell us what the feedback has been in terms of what do coaches feel are the number one takeaways, the number one benefits that they get out of instituting a captain's council. What's the feedback like on the positive side?
Well, one thing is, I've had some coaches that have been hesitant because they just get tired of the captains. Like I said, every coach that's run a captain's council has gone more all in the next year. Oh yeah, I'm in. No, wait, we need this even bigger. And it's because of of stories where you start to see the quiet guy start to become empowered as a leader. Like a quiet, leader, he's often probably thinking a lot of things. He's probably more aware than the really loud vocal leader. And so it really facilitates those players opportunities to lead, in the one-on-one texts that they send to their guys in their unit, just different things like that. So it really does develop those leaders. It decentralizes command. So a coach doesn't feel responsibility or ownership of every aspect. He's still taking ownership of the program, but it's like, honestly, it takes things off your plate. You get worn out having to be the one that always starts practice or the one that's always making sure everyone's there on time. And I see a lot of coaches that they don't even have a big group team text that much anymore. They'll just text the captains and be like, hey, change of times. We're leaving at 8 tomorrow, not 9. Make sure everyone's there and sweats. There you go. Done. And then if it doesn't follow and they don't follow through on it, and Johnny on the team he's not in his proper shoes, he just goes to the captain. And what's going on there? And that's, so there's a decentralized command, the connected team. You see teams are way more connected as a group because you are intentional in that unit selection. So guys that maybe would never talk to each other because, well, he's a sophomore and I'm a senior, all of a sudden they're actually having, like the college level, they're having lunch once a week in the cafeteria because that's one of their commitments as a unit. The big piece of support and accountability, you just got guys on other guys, holding them accountable, not just holding them accountable, but supporting them when they're struggling, reaching out. And at the end of the day, like everything that we try to do with coaches to help develop a player-led culture, it's actually helping make that happen. Like it really is bringing them into some hard decisions that you have to make and allowing their opinion to be heard and allowing them sometimes to make that decision. Hey, do we need a practice tomorrow? What's the pulse of the team? You just text your captains and they feel empowered. They feel safe to go, Coach, I know you'd love to go another one here, but we need the day off. And they feel empowered in that moment and they feel safe to be able to speak up. And that's honestly what your team needed. And so it's that player-led culture.
Yeah, I think that safety piece is a huge one, especially if you go back in time over the history of coaching and sort of the player-coach relationship and how it's changed over the years, where you used to have that my way or the highway type coaching where the idea of players having input into decisions that are being made on the team 25, 30 years ago was extremely, extremely rare. Whereas now I think that, you're starting to see with just the way that relationships between coaches and players have changed and developed and clearly become stronger in that way, that if you're a coach and you're not taking advantage of getting buy-in from your players and getting input from them on how the team is run and what they're doing. And that's not to say that you're completely turning over all the decisions to them, but it is very, very important, I think, to get their input to create that investment like you described. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on, any key points that we've missed in terms of why a coach should want to implement a captain's council? Is there anything that we haven't hit on?
I guess my biggest thing is it's regardless of your level, because we've run it at freshman teams. We've run this at obviously high school teams, college teams, even a professional rugby team. It's just, it's going to really free you up. I think there's value in giving them books to read on leadership and putting them in some of these activities or these retreats. I think there's a lot of value and stuff out there, but this, I can't emphasize it enough. This is such a powerful way to take them through an experience that will be really transformative for them. And obviously leadership is a premium, like we talked about earlier. And I don't think there's many other better ways that we can serve our players and help them develop something that is going to really stand to them 5-10 years from now.
Yeah, and that long-term impact, I think, is one of the things that when you talk about what coaches do is so important. And it's something that we don't always see or recognize in the moment. I think coaches, we all know that we have that in the back of our head, that we're not just impacting our kids in the moment, in the season, that we have them in front of us, but we're impacting them for the long term. And I think this is a piece that, look, if a kid develops this ability as a captain, as part of their team, how powerful can that be when they get out into the real world and they have a job, or they're an employee, or they're a leader, or they own a company, or whatever it may be? Those skills are translatable. And that's really, again, what coaching is all about. Sure, the wins and losses are important. And we all know that, again, we're a lot happier when we win than when we lose. But at the same time, you ultimately can win the long game by helping your players to develop as people. And I think that's really what this is all about. So before we wrap up, JP, why don't you go ahead and share how people can find out more about the Captain's Council, where they can talk to you, how they can connect with you if they're interested in getting more information about how they can implement this with their team.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want to learn more about some of the stuff that we do, you can go over to thriveonchallenge.com. And there's a lot of coaches that we work with throughout the season. This is one of the things we help them implement. But there's a lot of coaches that aren't maybe necessarily interested in that sort of relationship, and that's fine. So I've actually released, just recently enough, a Captain's Council course on coachtube.com. The course kind of really walks you through all the very, very finer things of this. And I think that I've had the fortune of working with so many different teams. So you're talking about hundreds of seasons over the last 4 years that I've been able to really see what works and see what doesn't. And with that course, you also get, a couple of documents, that just help to save you some time on like one's like a Google form for when your players vote, that just, it scores it in a certain way that a first place vote means more than a fourth place vote, as far as for captain. So it just helps to make it less and less of a popularity contest, and some of the stuff that we do there, as well as you get access to like a Google Doc that our coaches in the TOC community have access to, which is just, as we make improvements in the system, it's just live updated. So it's a really valuable course. I'll give you a link, and you could, kind of put in the episode details, but it's on coachtube.com. And the link that I'll give you and the coupon code is HoopsHeadCC, and that'll help coaches save 10% off the course.
That's terrific. And JP, I'm really excited about what we're going to be able to do here in terms of our Culture Camp episodes, and just getting you on to be able to share all the knowledge that you've developed through the years with your own coaching and with working with coaches from honestly all over the world and in different sports. I think you bring a perspective that any coach is going to want to listen to. And then also, I think one of the things that I loved about what you do in our first episode and this one, and just the things that you do with Thrive on Challenge, is that it's practical stuff. It's things that I can read about, I can listen to, and I can implement right away and have it make an impact on my team. And really, I think that's what it's all about. So I'm excited with where we're going to go with this thing, and glad that you're willing to be a part of it. And I look forward to our future episodes without question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation. You ask great questions because it's about moving to the practical things away from just the theory and the principles, which so often I think we just get stuck at. We understand in theory what it should look like, but we don't know actually how to make that happen.
Absolutely. JP, can't thank you enough for spending some time with us, and we look forward to our next Culture Camp episode. And to everyone out there, thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Hoop Heads podcast, presented by Head Start Basketball.